Chapter 10 on Conservatism and Libertarianism. 1. Let me begin by discussing two possible meanings of the term conservative. The first meaning is to refer to someone as conservative who generally supports the status quo. That is, a person who wants to conserve whatever laws, rules, regulations, moral and behavioral codes happen to exist at any given point in time. Because different laws, rules, and political institutions are in place at different times and/or different locations, what the conservative supports depends on and changes with place and time. To be a conservative means nothing specific at all, except to like the existing order, whatever that may be. The first meaning can be discarded then. To state this is not to claim that no one has ever adopted this meaning of conservatism. In fact, a prominent example of a conservative who comes very close to accepting the definition rejected here as useless is Michael Oakeshott. For Oakeshott, conservatism is, quote, not a creed or a doctrine, but a disposition. It is a propensity to use and to enjoy what is available rather than to wish for or to look for something else. To delight in what is present rather than what was or what may be. It is to prefer the tried to the untried, fact to mystery, the actual to the possible, the limited to the unbounded, the near to the distant, the sufficient to the superabundant, the convenient to the perfect, present laughter to utopian bliss. End quote. The term conservative must have a different meaning. What it means, and possibly only can mean, is this. Conservative refers to someone who believes in the existence of a natural order, a natural state of affairs which corresponds to the nature of things, of nature and man. This natural order is and can be disturbed by accidents and anomalies, by earthquakes and hurricanes, diseases, pests, monsters and beasts, by two-headed horses or four-legged humans, cripples and idiots, and by war, conquest and tyranny. But it is not difficult to distinguish the normal from the anomaly, the essential from the accidental. A little bit of abstraction removes all the clutter and enables nearly everyone to see what is and what is not natural and in accordance with the nature of things. Moreover, the natural is at the same time the most enduring state of affairs. The natural order is ancient and forever the same. Only anomalies and accidents undergo change. Hence, it can be recognized by us everywhere and at all times. Conservative refers to someone who recognizes the old and natural through the noise of anomalies and accidents, and who defends, supports, and helps to preserve it against the temporary and anomalous. Within the realm of the humanities, including the social sciences, a conservative recognizes families, fathers, mothers, children, grandchildren, and households based on private property and in cooperation with a community of other households as the most fundamental, natural, essential, ancient, and indispensable social units. Moreover, the family household also represents the model of the social order at large. Just as a hierarchical order exists in a family, so is there a hierarchical order within a community of families, of apprentices, servants and masters, vassals, knights, lords, overlords, and even kings, tied together by an elaborate and intricate system of kinship relations, and of children, parents, priests, bishops, cardinals, patriarchs or popes, and finally the transcendent God. Of the two layers of authority, the earthly physical power of parents, lords and kings is naturally subordinate and subject to control by the ultimate spiritual intellectual authority of fathers, priests, bishops, and ultimately God. Conservatives, or more specifically Western Greco-Christian conservatives, if they stand for anything, stand for and want to preserve the family and the social hierarchies and layers of material as well as spiritual intellectual authority based on and growing out of family bonds and kinship relations. In Conservatism, Dream and Reality, Robert Nisbet writes, naturally, the conservatives in their appeal to tradition were not endorsing each and every idea or thing handed down from the past. The philosophy of traditionalism is, like all such philosophies, selective. A salutary tradition must come from the past, but it must also be desirable in itself. The two central concepts in conservative philosophy, Nisbet goes on to explain, are property and voluntarily acknowledged authority, which in turn imply both liberty and order. Property, in conservative philosophy, is more than external appendage to man, mere inanimate servant of human need. It is, above anything else in civilization, the very condition of man's humanness, his superiority over the entire natural world. Much of the conservative veneration for the family lies in its historic affinity between family and property. It is usually the rule for any family to seek as much advantage for its children and other members as is possible. There is no issue over which conservative has fought liberal and socialist as strenuously as on threats through law to loosen property from family grasp by taxation or by any other form of redistribution. Almost everything about the medieval law of family and marriage, including the stringent emphasis upon chastity of the female, the terrible penalty that could be exerted against adultery by the wife, springs from a nearly absolute reverence for property, for legitimate heritability of property." End quote. Similarly, the conservative emphasis on authority and social rank orders, and the affinity to medieval, pre-Reformation Europe as a model of social organization, is rooted in the primacy of family and property. There is, explains Nesbitt, quote, "no principle more basic to the conservative philosophy than that of the inherent and absolute incompatibility between liberty and equality. Such incompatibility springs from the contrary objectives of the two values. The abiding purpose of liberty is its protection of individual and family property, a word used in its widest sense to include the immaterial as well as the material in life. The inherent objective of equality, on the other hand, is that of some kind of redistribution or leveling of the unequally shared material and immaterial values of a community. Moreover, individual strengths of mind and body being different from birth, all efforts to compensate through law and government for this diversity of strengths can only cripple the liberties of those involved, especially the liberties of the strongest and the most brilliant." End quote. For the conservative, then, the preservation of property and liberty requires the existence of a natural elite or aristocracy, and he is accordingly strictly opposed to democracy. Indeed, notes Nisbet, quote, "for most conservatives, socialism appeared as an almost necessary emergent of democracy, and totalitarianism an almost equally necessary product of social democracy." End quote. 2. Let me now come to an evaluation of contemporary conservatism, and then go on to explain why conservatives today must be anti-statist libertarians, and, equally important, why libertarians must be conservatives. Modern conservatism in the United States and Europe is confused and distorted. This confusion is largely due to democracy. Under the influence of representative democracy, and with the transformation of the United States and Europe into mass democracies from World War I, conservatism was transformed from an anti-egalitarian, aristocratic, anti-statist ideological force into a movement of culturally conservative statists, the right wing of the socialists and social democrats. Most self-proclaimed contemporary conservatives are concerned, as they should be, about the decay of families, divorce, illegitimacy, loss of authority, multiculturalism, alternative lifestyles, social disintegration, sex, and crime. All of these phenomena represent anomalies and scandalous deviations from the natural order. A conservative must indeed be opposed to all of these developments and try to restore normalcy. However, most contemporary conservatives, at least most of the spokesmen of the conservative establishment, either do not recognize that their goal of restoring normalcy requires the most drastic, even revolutionary anti-statist social changes, or, if they know about this, they are members of the fifth column engaged in destroying conservatism from inside, and hence must be regarded as evil. That this is largely true for the so-called neoconservatives does not require further explanation here. Indeed, as far as their leaders are concerned, one suspects that most of them are of the latter, evil kind. They are not truly concerned about cultural matters, but recognize that they must play the cultural conservatism card so as not to lose power and promote their entirely different goal of global social democracy. The fundamental statist character of American neoconservatism is best summarized by a statement of one of its leading intellectual champions, the former Trotskyite Irvin Kristol. Quote, "The basic principle behind a conservative welfare state ought to be a simple one. Wherever possible, people should be allowed to keep their own money rather than having it transferred via taxes to the state, on the condition that they put it to certain defined uses." End quote. This view is essentially identical to that held by modern post-Marxist European Social Democrats. Thus, Germany's Social Democratic Party, SPD, for instance, in its Godesberg program of 1959, adopted as its core motto the slogan, "As much market as possible, as much state as necessary." A second, somewhat older but nowadays almost indistinguishable branch of contemporary American conservatism is represented by the new, post-World War II conservatism launched and promoted with the assistance of the CIA by William Buckley and his National Review. Whereas the old, pre-World War II American conservatism had been characterized by decidedly anti-interventionist, isolationist foreign policy views, the trademark of Buckley's new conservatism has been its rabid militarism and interventionist foreign policy. In an article, A Young Republican's View, published 3 years before the launching of his National Review in Commonweal on January 25, 1952, Buckley thus summarized what would become the new conservative credo. In light of the threat posed by the Soviet Union, quote, we, new conservatives, have to accept big government for the duration, for neither an offensive nor a defensive war can be waged except through the instrument of a totalitarian bureaucracy within our shores. End quote. Conservatives, Buckley wrote, were duty-bound to promote, quote, the extensive and productive tax laws that are needed to support a vigorous anti-communist foreign policy, end quote, as well as the, quote, large armies and air forces, atomic energy, central intelligence, war production boards, and the attendant centralization of power in Washington, end quote. Not surprisingly, since the collapse of the Soviet Union in the late 1980s, essentially nothing in this philosophy has changed. Today, the continuation and preservation of the American welfare-warfare state is simply excused and promoted by new and neoconservatives alike with reference to other foreign enemies and dangers, China, Islamic fundamentalism, Saddam Hussein, rogue states, and or the threat of global terrorism. End quote. Regarding this new Buckleyite conservatism, Robert Nesbitt has noted that of, quote, or the misascription of the word conservative, the most amusing, in an historical light, is surely the application of conservative to the last named, that is, the budget-expanding enthusiast for great increases in military expenditures. For in America throughout the 20th century, and including 4 substantial wars abroad, conservatives have been steadfastly the voices of non-inflationary military budgets, and an emphasis on trade in the world instead of American nationalism. In the 2 world wars, in Korea and in Vietnam, the leaders of American entry into the war were such renowned liberal progressives as Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman, and John F. Kennedy. In all 4 episodes, conservatives, both in the national government and in the rank and file, were largely hostile to intervention, were isolationists indeed, end quote. And on Ronald Reagan in particular, during whose administration the new and neoconservative movement were fused and amalgamated, Nisbet has noted that Reagan's, quote, passion for crusade, moral and military, is scarcely American conservative, end quote. However, it is also true of many conservatives who are genuinely concerned about family disintegration or dysfunction and cultural rot. I'm thinking here in particular of the conservatism represented by Patrick Buchanan and his movement. Buchanan's conservatism is by no means as different from that of the Conservative Republican Party establishment as he and his followers fancy themselves. In one decisive respect, their brand of conservatism is in full agreement with that of the conservative establishment. Both are statists. They differ over what exactly needs to be done to restore normalcy to the U.S., but they agree that it must be done by the state. There is not a trace of principled anti-statism in either. Let me illustrate by quoting Samuel Francis, one of the leading theoreticians and strategists of the Buchanite movement. After deploring quote-unquote anti-white and quote-unquote anti-Western propaganda, quote, militant secularism, acquisitive egoism, economic and political globalism, demographic inundation, and unchecked state centralism, unquote, he expounds on a new spirit of, quote-unquote, America First, which, quote, implies not only putting national interests over those of other nations and abstractions, like world leadership, global harmony, and the New World Order, but also giving priority to the nation over the gratification of individual and subnational interests. End quote. So far, so good. But how does he propose to fix the problem of moral degeneration and cultural rot? Those parts of the federal Leviathan responsible for the proliferation of moral and cultural pollution, such as the Department of Education, the National Endowment of the Arts, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and the federal judiciary should be closed or cut down to size. But there is no opposition against the state's involvement in educational matters. There's no recognition that the natural order in education means that the state has nothing to do with it. Education is entirely a family matter. Buchanan and his intellectual allies want to abolish the federal government's control over educational matters and return such control to the level of states, or, better still, local government. However, neoconservatives and most of the leaders of the so-called Christian right and the quote-unquote moral majority simply desire, far worse from a genuinely conservative point of view, the replacement of the current left liberal elite in charge of national education by another one, that is, themselves. Quote, from Burke on, unquote, Robert Nisbet has criticized this posture. Quote, it has been a conservative precept and a sociological principle since Auguste Comte that the surest way of weakening the family or any vital social group is for the government to assume and then monopolize the family's historic functions. Unquote. In contrast, much of the contemporary American right, quote, is less interested in Burkean immunities from government power than it is in putting a maximum of governmental power in the hands of those who can be trusted. It is control of power, not diminution of power, that ranks high. Unquote. From the traditional conservative point of view, it is fatuous to use the family, as evangelical crusaders regularly do, as the justification for their tireless crusades to ban abortion categorically, to bring the Department of Justice in on every baby doe, to mandate by constitution the imposition of quote-unquote voluntary prayers in the public schools, and so on. Moreover, there is no recognition that moral degeneracy and cultural rot have deeper causes and cannot simply be cured by state-imposed curriculum changes or exhortations and declamations. To the contrary, Francis proposes that the cultural turnaround, the restoration of normalcy, can be achieved without a fundamental change in the structure of the modern welfare state. Indeed, Buchanan and his ideologues explicitly defend the three core institutions of the welfare state: Social Security, Medicare, and unemployment subsidies. They even want to expand the quote-unquote social responsibilities of the state by assigning to it the task of quote-unquote protecting, by means of national import and export restrictions, American jobs, especially in industries of national concern, and quote insulate the wages of U.S. workers from foreign laborers who must work for $1 an hour or less. Unquote. In fact, Buchananites freely admit that they are statists. They detest and ridicule capitalism, laissez-faire, free markets and trade, wealth, elites, and nobility, and they advocate a new populist, indeed proletarian conservatism, which amalgamate social and cultural conservatism and social or socialist economics. Thus continues Francis, quote, while the left could win middle Americans through its economic measures, it lost them through its social and cultural radicalism, and while the right could attract middle Americans through appeals to law and order and defense of sexual normality, conventional morals and religion, traditional social institutions, and invocations of nationalism and patriotism, it lost middle Americans when it rehearsed its old bourgeois economic formulas. End quote. Hence it is necessary to combine the economic policies of the left and the nationalism and cultural conservatism of the right to create, quote, a new identity synthesizing both the economic interests and cultural national loyalties of the proletarianized middle class in a separate and unified political movement. End quote. For obvious reasons, this doctrine is not so named, but there is a term for this type of conservatism. It is called social nationalism or national socialism. I will not concern myself here with the question whether or not Buchanan's conservatism has mass appeal and whether or not its diagnosis of American politics is sociologically correct. I doubt that this is the case, and certainly Buchanan's fate during the 1995 and 2000 Republican presidential primaries does not indicate otherwise. Rather, I want to address the more fundamental questions. Assuming that it does have such appeal, that is, assuming that cultural conservatism and social socialist economics can be psychologically combined, that is, that people can hold both of these views simultaneously without cognitive dissonance, can they also be effectively and practically, economically and praxeologically combined? Is it possible to maintain the current level of economic socialism, social security, etc., and reach the goal of restoring cultural normalcy, natural families, and normal rules of conduct? Buchanan and his theoreticians do not feel the need to raise this question because they believe politics to be solely a matter of will and power. They do not believe in such things as economic laws. If only people want something and they are given the power to implement their will, everything can be achieved. The quote-unquote dead Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises, to whom Buchanan referred contemptuously during his campaign, characterized his belief as quote-unquote historicism, the intellectual posture of the German Kathedersozialisten, the academic socialist of the chair, who justified any and all statist measures. But historicist contempt and ignorance of economics does not alter the fact that inexorable economic laws exist. You cannot have your cake and eat it too, for instance, or what you consume now cannot be consumed again in the future, or producing more of one good requires producing less of another. No wishful thinking can make such laws go away. To believe otherwise can only result in practical failure. In fact, noted Mises, quote, economic history is a long record of government policies that failed because they were designed with a bold disregard for the laws of economics, unquote. Princes and democratic majorities, writes Mises leading directly up to this verdict, quote, are drunk with power. They must reluctantly admit that they are subject to the laws of nature, but they reject the very notion of economic law. Are they not the supreme legislators? Don't they have the power to crush every opponent? No warlord is prone to acknowledge any limit other than those imposed on him by a superior armed force. Servile scribblers are always ready to foster such complacency by expounding the appropriate doctrines. They call their garbled presumptions historical economics. End quote. In light of elementary and immutable economic laws, the Buchanite program of social nationalism is just another bold but impossible dream. No wishful thinking can alter the fact that maintaining the core institutions of the present welfare state and wanting to return to traditional families, norms, conduct, and culture are incompatible goals. You can have one, socialism, welfare, or the other, traditional morals, but you cannot have both. For social nationalist economics, the pillar of the current welfare system Buchanan wants to leave untouched is the very cause of cultural and social anomalies. In order to clarify this, it is only necessary to recall one of the most fundamental laws of economics, which says that all compulsory wealth or income redistribution, regardless of the criteria on which it is based, involves taking from some, the havers of something, and giving it to others, the non-havers of something. Accordingly, the incentive to be a haver is reduced, and the incentive to be a non-haver increased. What the haver has is characteristically something considered good, and what the non-haver does not have is something bad, or a deficiency. Indeed, this is the very idea underlying any redistribution. Some have too much good stuff, and others not enough. The result of every redistribution is that one will thereby produce less good and increasingly more bad, less perfection and more deficiencies. By subsidizing with tax funds, with funds taken from others, people who are poor, bad, more poverty will be created. By subsidizing people because they are unemployed, bad, more unemployment will be created. By subsidizing unwed mothers, bad, there will be more unwed mothers and more illegitimate births, etc. Obviously, this basic insight applies to the entire system of so-called social security that has been implemented in Western Europe from the 1880s onward and the US since the 1930s, of compulsory government insurance against old age, illness, occupational injury, unemployment, indigence, etc. In conjunction with the even older compulsory system of public education, these institutions and practices amount to a massive attack on the institution of the family and personal responsibility. By relieving individuals of the obligation to provide for their own income, health, safety, old age, and children's education, the range and temporal horizon of private provision is reduced, and the value of marriage, family, children, and kinship relations is lowered. Irresponsibility, short-sightedness, negligence, illness, and even destructionism, bads, are promoted, and responsibility, far-sightedness, diligence, health, and conservatism, goods, are punished. The compulsory old age insurance system in particular, by which retirees, the old, are subsidized from taxes imposed on current income earners, the young, has systematically weakened the natural intergenerational bond between parents, grandparents, and children. The old need no longer rely on the assistance of their children if they have made no provision for their own old age, and the young, with typically less accumulated wealth, must support the old with typically more accumulated wealth rather than the other way around, as is typical within families. Consequently, not only do people want to have fewer children, and indeed birth rates have fallen in half since the onset of modern social security welfare policies, but also the respect which the young traditionally accorded to their elders is diminished, and all indicators of family disintegration and malfunctioning, such as rates of divorce, illegitimacy, child abuse, parent abuse, spouse abuse, single parenting, singledom, alternative lifestyles, and abortion, have increased. Moreover, with the socialization of the healthcare system through institutions such as Medicaid and Medicare, and regulation of the insurance industry by restricting an insurance right of refusal to exclude any individual risk as uninsurable and discriminate freely according to actuarial methods between different group risks, A monstrous machinery of wealth and income redistribution at the expense of responsible individuals and low-risk groups in favor of irresponsible actors and high-risk groups has been put in motion. Subsidies for the ill, unhealthy, and disabled breed illness, disease, and disability, and weaken the desire to work for a living and to lead healthy lives. One can do no better than quote the quote-unquote dead Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises once more. Quote, "Being ill is not a phenomenon independent of conscious will. A man's efficiency is not merely a result of his physical condition, it depends largely on his mind and will. The destructionist aspect of accident and health insurance lies above all in the fact that such institutions promote accident and illness, hinder recovery, and very often create, or at any rate intensify and lengthen, the functional disorders which follow illness or accident. To feel healthy is quite different from being healthy in the medical sense. By weakening or completely destroying the will to be well and able to work, social insurance creates illness and inability to work. It produces the habit of complaining, which is in itself a neurosis of other kinds. As a social institution, it makes a people sick bodily and mentally, or at least helps to multiply, lengthen, and intensify disease. Social insurance has thus made the neurosis of the insured a dangerous public disease. Should the institution be extended and developed, the disease will spread. No reform can be of any assistance. We cannot weaken or destroy the will to health without producing illness." End quote. I do not wish to explain here the economic nonsense of Buchanan's and his theoreticians' even further reaching idea of protectionist policies of protecting American wages. If they were right, their argument in favor of economic protection would amount to an indictment of all trade and a defense of the thesis that everyone, each family, would be better off if it never traded with anyone else. Certainly, in this case, no one could ever lose his job, and unemployment due to unfair competition would be reduced to zero. Yet, such a full employment society would not be prosperous and strong. It would be composed of people, families, who, despite working from dawn to dusk, would be condemned to poverty and starvation. Buchanan's international protectionism, while less destructive than a policy of interpersonal or interregional protectionism, would result in precisely the same effect. This is not conservatism. Conservatives want families to be prosperous and strong. This is economic destructionism. In any case, what should be clear by now is that most, if not all, of the moral degeneration and cultural rot, the signs of decivilization all around us, are the inescapable and unavoidable results of the welfare state and its core institutions. Classical, old-style conservatives knew this, and they vigorously opposed public education and social security. They knew that states everywhere were intent upon breaking down and ultimately destroying families and the institutions and layers and hierarchies of authority that are the natural outgrowth of family-based communities in order to increase and strengthen their own power. From the conservative point of view, writes Robert Nisbet, quote, "The abolition or sharp curtailment of intermediate associations in the social order spelled the creation of the atomized masses on the one hand and, on the other, increasingly centralized forms of political power." End quote. During the Middle Ages, Nisbet explains elsewhere, quoting Pollard's study of Wolsey, power, quote, "was dilute, not because it was distributed in many hands, but because it was derived from many independent sources. There were the liberties of the Church, based on law superior to that of the king. There was the law of nature, graven in the hearts of men and not to be erased by royal writs. And there was the prescription of immemorial local and feudal custom, stereotyping a variety of jurisdictions and impeding the operation of a single will." Unquote. In distinct contrast, quote, "the modern state is monistic. Its authority extends directly to all individuals within its boundaries. So-called diplomatic immunities are but the last manifestation of a larger complex of immunities which once involved a large number of internal, religious, economic and kinship authorities. For administrative purposes, the state may deploy into provinces, departments, districts or states, just as the army divides into regiments and battalions. But like the army, the modern state is based upon a residual unity of power. This extraordinary unity of relationship in the contemporary state, together with its massive accumulation of effective functions, makes the control of the state the greatest single goal or prize in modern struggles for power. Increasingly, the objectives of economic and other interest associations become not so much the preservation of favored immunities from the state as the capturing or directing of the political power itself." End quote. They knew that in order to do so, states would have to take advantage of the natural rebellion of the adolescent, juvenile against parental authority, and they knew that socialized education and socialized responsibility were the means of bringing about this goal. Social education and social security provide an opening for the rebellious youth to escape parental authority, to get away with continuous misbehavior. Old conservatives knew that these policies would emancipate the individual from the discipline imposed by family and community life, only to subject it instead to the direct and immediate control of the state. Furthermore, they knew, or at least had a hunch, that this would lead to a systematic infantilization of society, a regression, emotionally and mentally, from adulthood to adolescence or childhood. In contrast, Buchanan's populist proletarian conservatism, social nationalism, shows complete ignorance of all of this. Combining cultural conservatism and welfare statism is impossible, and hence economic nonsense. Welfare statism, social security in any way, shape or form, breeds moral and cultural rot and degeneration. Thus, if one is indeed concerned about America's moral decay and wants to restore normalcy to society and culture, one must oppose all aspects of the modern social welfare state. A return to normalcy requires no less than the complete elimination of the present social security system, of unemployment insurance, social security, Medicare, Medicaid, public education, etc., and thus the near-complete dissolution and deconstruction of the current state apparatus and government power. If one is ever to restore normalcy, government funds and power must dwindle to or even fall below their 19th century levels. Hence, true conservatives must be hard-line libertarians, anti-statists. Buchanan's conservatism is false. It wants a return to traditional morality, but at the same time advocates keeping the very institutions in place that are responsible for the perversion and destruction of traditional morals. 3. Most contemporary conservatives, then, especially among the media darlings, are not conservatives but socialists, either of the international sort, the new and neoconservative warfare welfare statists and global social democrats, or of the nationalist variety, the Buchanite populists. Genuine conservatives must be opposed to both. In order to restore social and cultural normalcy, true conservatives can only be radical libertarians, and they must demand the demolition, as a moral and economic perversion, of the entire structure of social security. If conservatives must be libertarians, why must libertarians be conservatives? If conservatives must learn from libertarians, must libertarians also learn from conservatives? First, a few terminological clarifications are in order. The term libertarianism, as employed here, is a 20th century phenomenon, or more accurately, a post-World War II phenomenon with intellectual roots in both classical, 18th and 19th century liberalism, and even older natural law philosophy. It is a product of modern, Enlightenment rationalism. Culminating in the work of Murray and Rothbard, the fountainhead of the modern libertarian movement, and in particular his Ethics of Liberty, libertarianism is a rational system of ethics, law, working within a tradition of classical political philosophy of Hobbes, Grotius, Pufendorf, Locke, and Spencer, and employing the same ancient analytical, conceptual tools and logical apparatus as they do. Libertarianism, Rothbardianism, is a systematic law code derived by means of logical deduction from a single principle, the validity of which, and this is what makes it an ultimate principle, that is, an ethical axiom, and a libertarian law code, an axiomatic deductive theory of justice, cannot be disputed without falling prey to logical, practical, praxeological, or performative contradictions, that is, without implicitly affirming what one explicitly denies. This axiom is the ancient principle of original appropriation, ownership of scarce resources. The right of an exclusive control over scarce resources, private property, is acquired through an act of original appropriation, by which resources are taken out of a state of nature and put into a state of civilization. If this were not so, no one could ever begin to act, do, or propose anything. Hence, any other principle is praxeologically impossible and argumentatively indefensible. From the principle of original appropriation, the first use, first own principle, rules concerning the transformation and the transfer, exchange of originally appropriated resources are derived, and all of ethics, law, including the principles of punishment, is then reconstructed in terms of a theory of property rights. All human rights are property rights, and all human rights violations are property rights violations. The upshot of this libertarian theory of justice is well known in these circles. The state, according to the most influential strand of libertarian theory, the Rothbardian one, is an outlaw organization, and the only social order that is just is a system of private property anarchy. I do not want to further analyze or defend the libertarian theory of justice at this point. Let me only confess that I believe the theory to be true, indeed to be irrefutably true. Briefly, two central arguments have been advanced in defense of this claim. The first, initially outlined by Rothbard, proceeds via an argumentum a contrario. If, contrary to the principle of first or original appropriation, a person A were not considered the owner of his visibly, demonstrably, and intersubjectively ascertainably appropriated body, and the standing room and places originally, prior to everyone else, appropriated through him by means of his body, then only two alternative arrangements exist. Either another, later coming person B must be recognized as the owner of A's body and the places originally appropriated by A, or both A and B must be considered equal co-owners of all bodies and places. The third conceivable alternative, that no one should own any body and originally appropriated place, can be ruled out as an impossibility. Acting requires a body and standing room, and we cannot not act. Hence, to adopt this alternative would imply the instant death of all mankind. In the first case, A would be reduced to the rank of B's slave and subject of exploitation. B is the owner of the body and places originally appropriated by A, but A in turn is not the owner of the body and places so appropriated by B. Under this ruling, two categorically distinct classes of persons are constituted: slaves or Untermenschen, such as A, and masters or Übermenschen, such as B, to whom different laws apply. Hence, while such a ruling is certainly possible, it must be discarded from the outset as a human ethic, equally and universally applicable for everyone qua human being, rational animal. For a rule to aspire to the rank of a law, a just rule, it is necessary that it apply equally and universally to everyone. The rule under consideration manifestly does not fulfill this universalization requirement. Alternatively, in the second case of universal and equal co-ownership, the universalization requirement is apparently fulfilled. However, this alternative suffers from another, even more severe deficiency, because if it were adopted, all of mankind would perish immediately, for every action of a person requires the use of scarce means, at least his body and its standing room. However, if all goods were co-owned by everyone, then no one at any time or place would be allowed to do anything unless he had previously secured everyone else's consent to do so. Yet how could anyone grant such consent if he were not the exclusive owner of his own body, including its vocal cords, by means of which this consent would be expressed? Indeed, he would first need others' consent in order to be allowed to express his own, but these others could not give their consent without first having his, etc. Thus only the first alternative, the principle of original appropriation, is left. It fulfills the universalization requirement, and it is praxeologically possible. The second argument, first advanced by this author, and yielding essentially the same conclusion, has the form of an impossibility theorem. The theorem proceeds from a logical reconstruction of the necessary conditions, Bedingungen der Möglichkeit, of ethical problems, and an exact definition and delineation of the purpose of ethics. First, for ethical problems to arise, conflict between separate and independent agents must exist, or must at least be possible, and a conflict can only emerge in turn with respect to scarce means or economic goods. A conflict is possible neither with respect to superabundant or free goods, such as, under normal circumstances, the air that we breathe, nor with respect to scarce but non-appropriable goods, such as the sun or the clouds, that is, the conditions rather than the means of human action. Conflict is possible only with respect to controllable, appropriable means, such as a specific piece of land, tree, or cave situated in a specific and unique spatial-temporal relation vis-à-vis the sun and or the rain clouds. Hence, the task of ethics is to propose rules regarding the proper versus the improper use of scarce means. That is, ethics concerns the assignment of rights of exclusive control over scarce goods, that is, property rights, in order to rule out conflict. Conflict, however, is not a sufficient prerequisite for ethical problems, for one can come into conflict also with a gorilla or a mosquito, for instance, yet such conflicts do not give rise to ethical problems. Gorillas and mosquitoes pose merely a technical problem. We must learn how to successfully manage and control the movements of gorillas and mosquitoes, just as we must learn to manage and control the inanimate objects of our environment. Only if both parties to a conflict are capable of propositional exchange, that is, argumentation, can one speak of an ethical problem. That is, only if the gorilla and or the mosquito could, in principle, pause in their conflictuous activity and express yes or no, that is, present an argument, would one owe them an answer. The impossibility theorem proceeds from this proposition in clarifying first its axiomatic status. No one can deny, without falling into performative contradictions, that the common rationality as displayed by the ability to engage in propositional exchange constitutes a necessary condition for ethical problems, because this denial would itself have to be presented in the form of a proposition. Even an ethical relativist who admits the existence of ethical questions but denies that there are any valid answers cannot deny the validity of this proposition, which, accordingly, has been referred to also as the a priori of argumentation. Second, it is pointed out that everything that must be presupposed by argumentation cannot in turn be argumentatively disputed without getting entangled in a performative contradiction, and that among such presuppositions there exist not only logical ones, such as the laws of propositional logic, for instance, the law of identity, but also praxeological ones. Argumentation is not just free-floating propositions, but always involves also at least two distinct arguers, a proponent and an opponent. That is, argumentation is a subcategory of human action. Third, it is then shown that the mutual recognition of the principle of original appropriation by both proponent and opponent constitutes a praxeological presupposition of argumentation. No one can propose anything and expect his opponent to convince himself of the validity of this proposition, or else deny it and propose something else, unless his and his opponent's right to exclusive control over their own originally appropriated body, brain, vocal cords, etc., and its respective standing room were already presupposed and assumed as valid. Finally, if the recognition of the principle of original appropriation forms the praxeological presupposition of argumentation, then it is impossible to provide a propositional justification for any other ethical principle without running thereby into performative contradictions. Rather, I want to turn to the question of the relationship between libertarianism and conservatism, the belief in a natural social order based and centered on families. Some superficial commentators, mostly from the conservative side, such as Russell Kirk, have characterized libertarianism and conservatism as incompatible, hostile, or even antagonistic ideologies. In fact, this view is entirely mistaken. The relationship between libertarianism and conservatism is one of praxeological compatibility, sociological complementarity, and reciprocal reinforcement. In order to explain this, let me first point out that most, though not all, leading libertarian thinkers were, as a matter of empirical fact, social-cultural conservatives, defenders of traditional bourgeois morals and manners. Most notably, Murray Rothbard, the single most important and influential libertarian thinker, was an outspoken cultural conservative. So was Rothbard's most important teacher, Ludwig von Mises. Ayn Rand, another major influence on contemporary libertarianism, is a different matter, of course. While this does not prove much, it does prove only that libertarianism and conservatism can be psychologically reconciled. It is indicative of a substantive affinity between the two doctrines. It is not difficult to recognize that the conservative and the libertarian views of society are perfectly compatible, congruent. To be sure, their methods are distinctly different. One is, or appears to be, empiristic, sociological and descriptive, and the other rationalistic, philosophical, logical, and constructivist. This difference notwithstanding, both agree in one fundamental respect, however. Conservatives are convinced that the natural and normal is old and widespread, and thus can be discerned always and everywhere. Similarly, libertarians are convinced that the principles of justice are eternally and universally valid, and hence must have been essentially known to mankind since its very beginnings. That is, the libertarian ethic is not new and revolutionary, but old and conservative. Even primitives and children are capable of grasping the validity of the principle of original appropriation, and most people usually recognize it as an unquestionable matter of fact. Moreover, as far as the object on which conservatives and libertarians focus is concerned, on the one hand families, kinship relations, communities, authority and social hierarchy, and on the other hand property and its appropriation, transformation and transfer, it should be clear that while they do not refer to identical entities, they still speak about different aspects of one and the same object, human actors and social cooperation. Extensively, that is, their realm of inquiry, frame of reference, is identical. Families, authority, communities, and social ranks are the empirical sociological concretization of the abstract philosophical praxeological categories and concepts of property, production, exchange, and contract. Property and property relations do not exist apart from families and kinship relations. The latter shape and determine the specific form and configuration of property and property relations, while they are at the same time constrained by the universal and eternal laws of scarcity and property. In fact, as we have already seen, families considered normal by conservative standards are household families, and the family disintegration and moral and cultural decay which contemporary conservatives deplore is largely the result of the erosion and destruction of households, states, as the economic basis of families by the modern welfare state. Thus, the libertarian theory of justice can actually provide conservatism with a more precise definition and a more rigorous moral defense of its own end, the return to civilization in the form of moral and cultural normalcy, than conservatism itself could ever offer. In doing so, it can further sharpen and strengthen conservatism's traditional anti-statist outlook. 4. While the intellectual creators of modern libertarianism were cultural conservatives, and while the libertarian doctrine is fully compatible and congruent with the conservative worldview, and does not, as some conservative critics claim, entail an quote-unquote atomistic individualism and quote-unquote acquisitive egoism corrupted by modern welfare state, the libertarian movement has undergone a significant transformation. To a large extent, and completely so in the eyes of the media and the public, it has become a movement that combines radical anti-statism and market economics with cultural leftism, counter- and multiculturalism, and personal hedonism. That is, it is the exact opposite of the Buchanite program of culturally conservative socialism, countercultural capitalism. Earlier it was noted that the Buchanite program of socialist nationalism does not seem to have much mass appeal, at least not in the United States. This is true to an even larger extent for the libertarian attempt to synthesize market economics with counter- and multiculturalism. Yet, as was the case with conservatism before, in this case, too, my central concern is not about mass appeal and whether or not certain ideas can be psychologically combined and integrated, but whether or not these ideas can be combined practically and effectively. It is my plan to show that they cannot, and that much of contemporary libertarianism is false, counterproductive libertarianism, much like Buchanan's conservatism is false and counterproductive. That much of modern libertarianism is culturally leftist is not due to any such leanings among the major libertarian theoreticians. As noted, they were for the most part cultural conservatives. Rather, it was the result of a superficial understanding of the libertarian doctrine by many of its fans and followers, and this ignorance has its explanation in a historical coincidence and a mentioned tendency inherent in the social democratic welfare state of promoting a process of intellectual and emotional infantilization, decivilization of society. The beginnings of the modern libertarian movement in the United States go back to the mid-1960s. In 1971, the Libertarian Party was founded, and in 1972 the philosopher John Hoppe was nominated as its first presidential candidate. It was the time of the Vietnam War, simultaneously promoted by the major advances in the growth of the welfare state from the early and mid-1960s onward in the United States, and similarly in Western Europe, the so-called civil rights legislation and the war on poverty. A new mass phenomenon emerged. A new lumpenproletariat of intellectuals and intellectualized youths, the products of an ever-expanding system of socialist public education, alienated from mainstream bourgeois morals and culture, while living far more comfortably than the lumpenproletariat of old, off the wealth created by this mainstream culture arose. Multiculturalism and cultural relativism, live and let live, and egalitarian anti-authoritarianism, respect no authority, were elevated from temporary and transitory phases in mental development, adolescence, to permanent attitudes among grown-up intellectuals and their students. The principal opposition of the libertarians to the Vietnam War coincided with the somewhat diffuse opposition to the war by the New Left. In addition, the anarchistic upshot of the libertarian doctrine appealed to the countercultural left. While ultimately judged a failure by most of its former protagonists, the alliance between the fledgling libertarian movement and the New Left during the mid- and late 1960s can be understood as motivated by two considerations. On the one hand, by the mid-1960s, American conservatism was almost completely dominated by William Buckley and his National Review. In contrast to the decidedly anti-interventionist, isolationist conservatism of the old right, the new conservatism, espoused by Buckley and the National Review, and represented most visibly by the 1964 Republican presidential candidate Barry Goldwater, was an ardently pro-war, pro-militaristic, and even imperialist movement. Based on this, any form of libertarian conservative alliance had to be judged as simply out of the question. On the other hand, when the New Left began to emerge around 1965, it appeared far more libertarian on crucial issues than the Conservatives for two reasons later summarized by Rothbard. 1. The New Left's increasingly thoroughgoing opposition to the Vietnam War, U.S. imperialism and the draft, the major political issues of that period, in contrast to Conservative support for these policies, and 2. Its forswearing of the old-fashioned statism and social democracy of the old left led the New Left to semi-anarchistic positions, to what seemed to be thoroughgoing opposition to the existing welfare-warfare post-New Deal corporate state and to the state-ridden bureaucratic university system. Writing nearly a decade later, Rothbard acknowledged a twofold strategic error in his erstwhile attempt to forge an alliance between libertarians and the New Left. A. Gravely overestimating the emotional stability and the knowledge of economics of these fledgling libertarians, and, as a corollary, B. Gravely underestimating the significance of the fact that these libertarian cadre were weak and isolated, that there was no libertarian movement to speak of, and therefore that herding these youngsters into an alliance with a far more numerous and powerful group was bound to lead to a high incidence of defection into real leftism of the left-wing anarchist, Maoist, syndicalist variety. For did not the illegitimacy of the state and the non-aggression axiom that one shall not initiate or threaten to initiate physical force against others and their property imply that everyone was at liberty to choose his very own non-aggressive lifestyle? Did this not imply that vulgarity, obscenity, profanity, drug use, promiscuity, pornography, prostitution, homosexuality, polygamy, pedophilia, or any other conceivable perversity or abnormality, insofar as they were victimless crimes, were no offences at all, but perfectly normal and legitimate activities and lifestyles? Not surprisingly, then, from the outset the libertarian movement attracted an unusually high number of abnormal and perverse followers. Subsequently, the countercultural ambience and multicultural relativistic tolerance of the libertarian movement attracted even greater numbers of misfits, personal or professional failures, or plain losers. Murray Rothbard, in his gust, called them the nihilo-libertarians, and identified them as the modal, typical and representative libertarians. They fantasized of a society where everyone would be free to choose and cultivate whatever non-aggressive lifestyle, career, or character he wanted, and where, as a result of free market economics, everyone could do so on an elevated level of general prosperity. Ironically, the movement that had set out to dismantle the state and restore private property and market economics was largely appropriated and its appearance shaped by the mental and emotional products of the welfare state, the new class of permanent adolescents. Murray and Rothbard has given the following portrait of the modal libertarian, ML. ML is indeed a he. The ML was in his 20s 20 years ago and is now in his 40s. That is neither as banal or as benign as it sounds, because it means that the movement has not really grown in 20 years. The ML is fairly bright and fairly well steeped in libertarian theory, but he knows nothing and cares less about history, culture, the context of reality or world affairs. His only reading or cultural knowledge is science fiction. The ML does not, unfortunately, hate the state because he sees it as the unique social instrument of organized aggression against person and property. Instead, the ML is an adolescent rebel against everyone around him. First against his parents, second against his family, third against his neighbors, and finally against society itself. He is especially opposed to institutions of social and cultural authority, in particular against the bourgeoisie from which he stemmed, against bourgeois norms and conventions, and against such institutions of social authority as churches. To the ML, then, the state is not a unique problem. It is only the most visible and odious of many hated bourgeois institutions. Hence the zest with which the ML sports the button, "Question authority," and hence, too, the fanatical hostility of the ML toward Christianity. I used to think that this militant atheism was merely a function of the Randianism out of which most modern libertarians emerged 2 decades ago. But atheism is not the key, for let someone in a libertarian gathering announce that he or she is a witch or a worshipper of crystal power or some other New Age hokum, and that person will be treated with great tolerance and respect. It is only Christians that are subject to abuse, and clearly the reason for the difference in treatment has nothing to do with atheism, but it has everything to do with rejecting and spurning bourgeois American culture. And any kind of cookie cultural cause will be encouraged in order to tweak the noses of the hated bourgeoisie. In point of fact, the original attraction of the MO to Randianism was part and parcel of his adolescent rebellion. What better way to rationalize and systematize rejection of one's parents family and neighbors than to join a cult which denounces religion and which trumpets the absolute superiority of yourself and your cult leaders as contrasted to the robotic second-handers who supposedly people the bourgeois world. A cult, furthermore, which calls upon you to spurn your parents, family, and bourgeois associates, and to cultivate the alleged greatness of your own individual ego, suitably guided, of course, by Randian leadership. The ML, if he has a real-world occupation, such as an accountant or lawyer, is generally a lawyer without a practice, and accountant without a job. The ML's modal occupation is computer programmer. Computers appeal indeed to the ML's scientific and theoretical bent, but they also appeal to his aggravated nomadism, to his need not to have a regular payroll or regular abode. The ML also has the 1,000-mile stare of the fanatic. He is apt to buttonhole you at the first opportunity and go on at great length about his own particular great discovery, about his mighty manuscript which is crying out for publication, if only it hadn't been suppressed by the powers that be. But above all, the ML is a moocher, a bunco artist, and often an outright crook. His basic attitude toward other libertarians is, your house is my house. In short, whether they articulate this philosophy or not, MLs are libertarian communists. Anyone with property is automatically expected to share it with other members of his extended libertarian family. 5. This intellectual combination could hardly end happily. Private property capitalism and egalitarian multiculturalism are as unlikely a combination as socialism and cultural conservatism. And in trying to combine what cannot be combined, much of the modern libertarian movement actually contributed to the further erosion of private property rights, just as much of contemporary conservatism contributed to the erosion of families and traditional morals. What the countercultural libertarians fail to recognize, and what true libertarians cannot emphasize enough, is that the restoration of private property rights and laissez-faire economics implies a sharp and drastic increase in social discrimination, and will swiftly eliminate most, if not all, of the multicultural egalitarian lifestyle experiments so close to the heart of left libertarians. In other words, libertarians must be radical and uncompromising conservatives. Contrary to the left libertarians assembled around such institutions as the Cato Institute and the Institute for Justice, for instance, who seek the assistance of the central government in the enforcement of various policies of non-discrimination and call for a non-discriminatory or free immigration policy, true libertarians must embrace discrimination, be it internal, domestic, or external, foreign. More specifically, left libertarians, LLS, employ and promote the employment of the federal government and its courts to squash discriminatory and presumably anti-libertarian state and or local laws and regulations. They thus contribute, regardless of their intention, to the anti-libertarian end of strengthening the central state. Correspondingly, LLS typically look favorably upon Lincoln and the Union government because the Union victory over the secessionist Confederacy resulted in the abolition of slavery, but they fail to recognize that this way of achieving the libertarian goal of abolishing slavery must lead to a drastic increase in the power of the central federal government, and that the Union victory in the Southern War of Independence indeed marks one of the great leaps forward in the growth of the modern federal leviathan, and hence represents a profoundly anti-libertarian episode in American history. Further, while LLS criticize the current practice of affirmative action as a quota system, they do not reject the so-called civil rights legislation from which the present practice developed as entirely and fundamentally incompatible with the cornerstone of libertarian political philosophy, that is, private property rights. To the contrary, LLS are very much concerned about quote-unquote civil rights, most prominently the quote-unquote right of gays and other alternative lifestylers not to be discriminated against in employment and housing. Accordingly, they look favorably on the U.S. Supreme Court decision in Brown v. Board of Education to outlaw segregation and the proto-socialist quote-unquote civil rights leader Martin Luther King. To be sure, LLS typically recognize the categorical difference between private and so-called public property, and at least in theory they admit that private property owners ought to have the right to discriminate regarding their own property as they please. But the LLS distinctly egalitarian concern for the lofty yet elusive idea of the, quote, progressive extension of dignity, unquote, instead of property rights, to, quote, women, to people of different religions and different races, unquote, misleads them to accept the very principle of quote-unquote non-discrimination, even if it is only applied and restricted to public property and the public sector of the economy. Hence the LLS advocacy of non-discriminatory or quote-unquote free immigration policy. Theoretically, LLS thereby commit the error of regarding public property as if it were either unowned quote-unquote land, open to unrestricted universal homesteading, while in fact all public property has been financed by domestic taxpayers, or as if it were quote-unquote communal property, open to every domestic citizen on an equal basis, while in fact some citizens have paid more taxes than others, and some, that is, those whose salaries or subsidies were paid out of taxes, have paid no taxes at all. Worse, in accepting the principle of non-discrimination for the realm of public property, LLS in fact contribute to the further aggrandizement of state power and the diminution of private property rights, for in today's state-ridden world, the dividing line between private and public has become increasingly fuzzy. All private property borders on and is surrounded by public streets. Virtually every business sells some of its products to some government agency or across state borders, and countless private firms and organizations, such as private universities for instance, regularly receive government funding. Hence, as seen from the perspective of the agents of the state, there is practically nothing left that is genuinely quote-unquote private and thus does not fall under government purview. Based on this all-pervasive entanglement of the state and public property with private business and private property, and given the government's unique coercive bargaining power, it can be safely predicted that the policy of quote-unquote non-discrimination will not remain a principle merely of public policy for long, but will instead increasingly become a general and ultimately universal principle, extending to and encompassing everyone and everything, public and private. Characteristically, LLS are typically also proponents of Milton Friedman's school voucher proposal, and are thus, it would seem, totally unaware that the implementation of the voucher plan would invariably lead to the expansion of government control from public schools to one including private schools, and the destruction of whatever autonomous decision-making rights the latter schools presently still possess. Indeed, private property means discrimination. I, not you, own such and such. I am entitled to exclude you from my property. I may attach conditions to your using my property, and I may expel you from my property. Moreover, you and I, private property owners, may enter and put our property into a restrictive or protective covenant. We and others may, if we both deem it beneficial, impose limitations on the future use that each of us is permitted to make with our property. The modern welfare state has largely stripped private property owners of the right to exclusion implied in the concept of private property. Discrimination is outlawed. Employers cannot hire whom they want. Landlords cannot rent to whom they want. Sellers cannot sell to whomever they wish. Buyers cannot buy from whoever they wish to buy. And groups of private property owners are not permitted to enter in whatever restrictive covenant they believe to be mutually beneficial. The state has thus robbed the people of much of their personal and physical protection. Not to be able to exclude others means not to be able to protect oneself. The result of this erosion of private property rights under the democratic welfare state is forced integration. Forced integration is ubiquitous. Americans must accept immigrants they do not want. Teachers cannot get rid of lousy or ill-behaved students. Employers are stuck with poor or destructive employees. Landlords are forced to live with bad renters. Banks and insurance companies are not allowed to avoid bad risks. Restaurants and bars must accommodate unwelcome customers, and private clubs and covenants are compelled to accept members and actions in violation of their very own rules and restrictions. Moreover, on public, that is government property in particular, forced integration has taken on a dangerous form of norm and lawlessness. Every property owner, Murray and Rothbard elaborated, should have the absolute right to sell, hire or lease his money or other property to anyone whom he chooses, which means he has the absolute right to, quote-unquote, discriminate all he damn pleases. If I have a plant and want to hire only 6-foot albinos, and I can find willing employees, I should have the right to do so, even though I might well lose my shirt doing so. If I own an apartment complex and want to rent only to Swedes without children, I should have the right to do so, etc. Outlawing such discrimination and restrictive covenants upholding it was the original sin from which all other problems followed. Once admit that principle, and everything else follows as the night the day. For if it is right and proper to outlaw my discriminating against blacks, then it is just as right and proper for the government to figure out if I am discriminating or not, and in that case it is perfectly legitimate for them to employ quotas to test the proposition. So, what is the remedy for all this? What has to be done is to repudiate quote-unquote civil rights and anti-discrimination laws totally, and in the meanwhile, on a separate but parallel track, try to privatize as much and as fully as we can." End quote. To exclude other people from one's own property is the very means by which an owner can avoid quote-unquote bads from happening, events that will lower the value of one's property. In not being permitted to freely exclude, the incidence of bads, ill-behaved, lazy, unreliable, rotten students, employees, customers will increase and property values will fall. In fact, forced integration, the result of all non-discrimination policies, breeds ill behavior and bad character. In civilized society, the ultimate price for ill behavior is expulsion, and all-round ill-behaved or rotten characters, even if they commit no criminal offence, will find themselves quickly expelled from everywhere and by everyone and become outcasts, physically removed from civilization. This is a stiff price to pay, hence the frequency of such behavior is reduced. By contrast, if one is prevented from expelling others from one's property whenever their presence is deemed undesirable, ill behavior, misconduct, and outright rotten characters are encouraged, rendered less costly. Rather than being isolated and ultimately entirely removed from society, the quote-unquote bums in every conceivable area of incompetency, bumhood, are permitted to perpetrate their unpleasantries everywhere, so bum-like behavior and bums will proliferate. The results of forced integration are only too visible. All social relations, whether in private or business life, have become increasingly egalitarian. Everyone is on a first-name basis with everyone else, and uncivilized. In distinct contrast, a society in which the right to exclusion is fully restored to owners of private property would be profoundly unegalitarian, intolerant, and discriminatory. There would be little or no quote-unquote tolerance and quote-unquote open-mindedness so dear to left libertarians. Instead, one would be on the right path toward restoring the freedom of association and exclusion implied in the institution of private property if only towns and villages could and would do what they did as a matter of course until well into the 19th century in Europe and the United States. There would be signs regarding entrance requirements to the town, and once in town, requirements for entering specific pieces of property, for example, no beggars, bums or homeless, but also no homosexuals, drug users, Jews, Muslims, Germans or Zulus, and those who did not meet these entrance requirements would be kicked out as trespassers. Almost instantly, cultural and moral normalcy would reassert itself. Left libertarians and multi- or countercultural lifestyle experimentalists, even if they were not engaged in any crime, would once again have to pay a price for their behavior. If they continued with their behavior or lifestyle, they would be barred from civilized society and live physically separate from it in ghettos or on the fringes of society, and many positions or professions would be unattainable to them. In contrast, if they wished to live and advance within society, they would have to adjust and assimilate to the moral and cultural norms of the society they wanted to enter. To thus assimilate would not necessarily imply that one would have to give up one's substandard or abnormal behavior or lifestyle altogether. It would imply, however, that one could no longer quote-unquote come out and exhibit one's alternative behavior or lifestyle in public. Such behavior would have to stay in the closet, hidden from the public eye and physically restricted to the total privacy of one's own four walls. Advertising or displaying it in public would lead to expulsion. To avoid any misunderstanding, it might be useful to point out that the predicted rise in discrimination in a purely libertarian world does not imply that the form and extent of discrimination will be the same or similar everywhere. To the contrary, the libertarian world could and likely would be one with a great variety of locally separated communities engaging in distinctly different and far-reaching discrimination, explains Murray N. Rothbard. In a country or a world of totally private property, including streets, and of private contractual neighborhoods consisting of property owners, these owners can make any sort of neighborhood contracts they wish. In practice, then, the country would be a truly, quote-unquote, gorgeous mosaic, ranging from rowdy Greenwich Village-type contractual neighborhoods to socially conservative, homogeneous WASP neighborhoods. Remember that all deeds and covenants would once again be totally legal and enforceable with no meddling government restrictions upon them. So that considering the drug question, if a proprietary neighborhood contracted that no one would use drugs, and Jones violated the contract and used them, his fellow community contractors could simply enforce the contract and kick him out. Or, since no advance contract can allow for all conceivable circumstances, suppose that Smith became so personally obnoxious that his fellow neighborhood owners wanted him ejected. They would then have to buy him out, probably on terms set contractually in advance in accordance with some quote-unquote obnoxious clause. End quote. Notwithstanding the variety of discriminatory policies pursued by different proprietary communities, however, and as will be further argued in the following above, for the sake of self-preservation, each of these communities will have to recognize and enforce some strict and rather inflexible limitations with respect to its internal tolerance. That is, no proprietary community can be as quote-unquote tolerant and quote-unquote non-discriminatory as left libertarians wish every place to be. Moreover, true conservative libertarians, in contrast to left libertarians, must not only recognize and emphasize the fact that there will be a sharp increase in discrimination, exclusion, expulsion in a libertarian society wherein private property rights are fully restored to the owners of private households and estates. More importantly, they will have to recognize, and conservatives and conservative insights can be helpful in achieving this, that this ought to be so. That is, that there should be strict discrimination if one wants to reach the goal of a private property anarchy or a pure private law society. Without continued and relentless discrimination, a libertarian society would quickly erode and degenerate into welfare state socialism. Every social order, including a libertarian or conservative one, requires a self-enforcement mechanism. More precisely, social orders, unlike mechanical or biological systems, are not maintained automatically. They require conscious effort and purposeful action on the part of the members of society to prevent them from disintegrating. 6. The standard libertarian model of a community is one of individuals who, instead of living physically separated and isolated from one another, associate with each other as neighbors living on adjacent but separately owned pieces of land. However, this model is too simplistic. Presumably, the reason for choosing neighbors over isolation is the fact that for individuals participating in and partaking of the benefits of the division of labor, a neighborhood offers the added advantage of lower transaction costs. That is, a neighborhood facilitates exchange. As a consequence, the value of an individually owned piece of land will be enhanced by the existence of neighboring pieces of land owned by others. However, while this may indeed be true and constitute a valid reason for choosing a neighborhood over physical isolation, it is by no means always true. A neighborhood also involves risks and may lead to falling rather than increasing property values, for even if one assumes, in accordance with the model under consideration, that the initial establishment of neighboring property was mutually beneficial, and even if it's further assumed that all members of a community refrain from criminal activity, it might still happen that a formerly quote-unquote good neighbor turns obnoxious, that he does not take care of his property or changes it so as to negatively affect the property values of other community members, or that he simply refuses to participate in any cooperative effort directed at improving the value of the community as a whole. Spencer H. McCollum, in The Art of Community, notes, quote, "So long as individuals have ownership in parts less than the whole, their interests will collide with the interests of others and with the common interests in any proposal that would affect land values unevenly. Yet, to avoid such measures would be to throw out planning and coordination of land uses completely, and with it, ultimately all land value. Aggravating the situation further is the absence of effective leadership to arbitrate the conflicts or to salvage the best of the bad situation. Lacking is someone who, while not identified with any special interest in the community, is at the same time strongly concerned for the success of the community as a whole. Property in land cannot be moved to an environment more favorable for its use. Its value as an economic good is a function of its surroundings. Its higher use, therefore, depends upon rearranging the environment to conform to it. Since the possible uses of a site depend on surrounding land uses, ultimately all human action is land use of one kind or another, it is essential for its most productive use that the uses of accessible surrounding land be coordinated. Seldom can this be done effectively under a multiplicity of separate authorities. If surrounding sites are owned in severalty, the several owners may or may not be able to accommodate their various uses to a comprehensive plan, depending on many, often fortuitous factors affecting the ability and wishes of each. They are neighbors of circumstance, not of convenience." End quote. Hence, in order to overcome the difficulties inherent in community development, when the land is held in divided ownership, the formation of neighborhoods and communities has in fact proceeded along different lines from those suggested in the above-mentioned model. Rather than being composed of adjacent pieces of land owned in severalty, then, neighborhoods have typically been proprietary or covenantal communities, founded and owned by a single proprietor who would, quote-unquote, lease separate parts of the land under specified conditions to selected individuals. To avoid any misunderstanding, the term lease is used here to include the sale of anything less than the full title to this thing. Thus, for example, the proprietor may sell all the rights to a house and a piece of land except for the right to build a house over a certain height or of other than a certain design, or to use the land for any other than residential purposes, etc., which rights are retained by the proprietary seller. Originally, such covenants were based on kinship relations, with the role of the proprietor performed by the head of a family or clan. In other words, just as the actions of the immediate family members are coordinated by the head and owner of the household within a single family household, so is the function of directing and coordinating the land uses of groups of neighboring households traditionally fulfilled by the head of an extended kinship group. McCollum explains, quote, "The proprietary community is not unique to our time and culture. Its roots are deep in human history. Within households in the primitive world, land is commonly administered by an elder male in the line of property succession. For groups of households, it may be administered by a clan, a lineage, or other group head, who is commonly an elder male of the kin group of widest span. And similarly, at the village level. This is, quote-unquote, the familiar pattern, in anthropologist Melville Herskovic's words, quote, of village land ownership held in trust and administered by the village head in behalf of its members, native or adopted, and family ownership for which the head of the family is trustee, unquote. The system is sometimes called seigneurialism, since the distributive authority is exercised by a senior member of the kin group at the span or level of organization in question." End quote. In modern times, characterized by massive population growth and a significant loss in the importance of kinship relations, this original libertarian model of a proprietary community has been replaced by new and familiar developments such as shopping malls and, quote-unquote, gated communities. Both shopping centers and gated residential communities are owned by a single entity, either an individual or a private corporation, and the relationship between the community proprietor and his renters and residents is purely contractual. The proprietor is an entrepreneur seeking profits from developing and managing residential and/or business communities which attract people as places where they want to reside and/or carry on their business. Spencer McCollum elaborates, quote, "The proprietor builds value in the inventory of community land chiefly by satisfying three functional requirements of a community which he alone, as an owner, can adequately fulfill: selection of members, land planning, and leadership. The first two functions, membership selection and land planning, are accomplished by him automatically in the course of determining to whom and for what purpose to let the use of land. The third function, leadership, is his natural responsibility, and also his special opportunity, since his interest alone is the success of the whole community rather than that of any special interest within it. Assigning land automatically establishes the kinds of tenants and their spatial juxtaposition to one another, and, hence, the economic structure of the community. Leadership also includes arbitration of differences among tenants, as well as guidance and participation in joint efforts. Indeed, in a fundamental sense, the security of the community is a part of the owner's real estate function. Under land planning, he supervises the design of all construction from the standpoint of safety. He also chooses tenants with a view to their compatibility and complementarity with other members of the community, and learns to anticipate in the leases and to provide in other ways against disputes developing among tenants. By his informal peacemaking and arbitrating, he resolves differences that might otherwise become serious. In these many ways, he ensures, quote-unquote, quiet possession, as it was so admirably phrased in the language of the common law, for his tenants. Moreover, once the ownerships are organized as participation in a single property, it becomes the common interest of the owners to redevelop and manage the whole as a unit in the most productive way, even to replanning the formerly fixed pattern of streets and common areas. It becomes their single interest to provide not only optimum physical environment, but optimum social environment as well, through an effective manager who can serve inconspicuously as expediter, peacemaker, and active catalyst to promote the freest possible conditions for the occupants to pursue their respective interests." End quote. Clearly, then, the task of maintaining the covenant entailed in the libertarian proprietary community is first and foremost that of the proprietor. Yet he is but one man, and it is impossible for him to succeed in this task unless he is supported in his endeavor by a majority of the members of the community in question. In particular, the proprietor needs the support of the community elite, that is, the heads of households and firms most heavily invested in the community. In order to protect and possibly enhance the value of their property and investments, both proprietor and the community elite must be willing and prepared to take two forms of protective measures. First, they must be willing to defend themselves by means of physical force and punishment against external invaders and domestic criminals. But second, and equally important, they must also be willing to defend themselves by means of ostracism, exclusion, and ultimately expulsion against those community members who advocate, advertise, or propagandize actions incompatible with the very purpose of the covenant, to protect property and family. McCollum notes on the importance of exclusion for the maintenance of social order, quote, "On all levels of society, both primitive and modern, exile is the natural and automatic remedy for default and fraud. By dispossession, he, the village head, exiles individuals who have made themselves intolerable, exactly as a shopping centre manager fails to renew the lease of an incompatible tenant. However infrequent in the village, as compared with modern proprietary communities, membership control is still a functional requisite of community life for which there must be regular provision." End quote. And in a footnote to this he adds, quote, "Anthropologist Raymond Firth records an expression of exile from the Pacific Island society of Tikopia that evokes in its simplicity the pathos of the Anglo-Saxon poem The Wanderer. Inasmuch as all land was owned by the chiefs, an exiled person had no recourse but to canoe out to sea, to suicide, or to life as a stranger on other islands. The expression for a person who is exiled translates that such a person, quote, has no place on which to stand." Unquote. In this regard, a community always faces the double and related threat of egalitarianism and cultural relativism. Egalitarianism in every form and shape is incompatible with the idea of private property. Private property implies exclusivity, inequality, and difference. And cultural relativism is incompatible with the fundamental, indeed foundational fact of families and intergenerational kinship relations. Families and kinship relations imply cultural absolutism. As a matter of socio-psychological fact, both egalitarian and relativistic sentiments find steady support among ever-new generations of adolescents. Owing to their still incomplete mental development, juveniles, especially of the male variety, are always susceptible to both ideas. Adolescence is marked by regular, and for this stage normal, outbreaks of rebellion by the young against the discipline imposed on them by family life and parental authority. Cultural relativism and multiculturalism provide the ideological instrument of emancipating oneself from these constraints. And egalitarianism, based on the infantile view that property is quote-unquote given and thus distributed arbitrarily, rather than individually appropriated and produced, and hence distributed justly, that is, in accordance with personal productivity, provides the intellectual means by which the rebellious youth can lay claim to the economic resources necessary for a life free of and outside the disciplinary framework of families. The enforcement of a covenant is largely a matter of prudence, of course. How and when to react, and what protective measures to take, requires judgment on the part of the members of the community, and especially the proprietor and the community elite. Thus, for instance, so long as the threat of moral relativism and egalitarianism is restricted to a small proportion of juveniles and young adults for only a brief period in life, until they settle back into family-constrained adulthood, it may well be sufficient to do nothing at all. The proponents of cultural relativism and egalitarianism would represent little more than temporary embarrassments or irritations, and punishment in the form of ostracism can be quite mild and lenient. A small dose of ridicule and contempt may be all that is needed to contain the relativistic and egalitarian threat. The situation is very different, however, and rather more drastic measures might be required once the spirit of moral relativism and egalitarianism has taken hold among adult members of society, among mothers, fathers, and heads of households and firms. As soon as mature members of society habitually express acceptance or even advocate egalitarian sentiments, whether in the form of democracy, majority rule, or of communism, it becomes essential that other members, and in particular the natural social elites, be prepared to act decisively and, in the case of continued nonconformity, exclude and ultimately expel these members from society. In a covenant concluded among proprietor and community tenants for the purpose of protecting their private property, no such thing as a right to free, unlimited speech exists, not even to unlimited speech on one's own tenant property. One may say innumerable things and promote almost any idea under the sun, but naturally no one is permitted to advocate ideas contrary to the very purpose of the covenant of preserving and protecting private property, such as democracy and communism. There can be no tolerance toward Democrats and Communists in a libertarian social order. They will have to be physically separated and expelled from society. Likewise, in a covenant founded for the purpose of protecting family and kin, there can be no tolerance toward those habitually promoting lifestyles incompatible with this goal. They, the advocates of alternative, non-family and kin-centered lifestyles, such as, for instance, individual hedonism, parasitism, nature-environment worship, homosexuality or communism, will have to be physically removed from society too if one is to maintain a libertarian order. 7. It should be obvious, then, that and why libertarians must be moral and cultural conservatives of the most uncompromising kind. The current state of moral degeneration, social disintegration and cultural rot is precisely the result of too much, and above all erroneous and misconceived, tolerance. Rather than having all habitual Democrats, communists, and alternative lifestylists quickly isolated, excluded, and expelled from civilization in accordance with the principles of the Covenant, they were tolerated by society. Yet this toleration only encouraged and promoted even more egalitarian and relativistic sentiments and attitudes, until at last the point was reached where the authority of excluding anyone for anything had effectively evaporated, while the power of the state, as manifested in state-sponsored forced integration policies, had correspondingly grown. Libertarians, in their attempt to establish a free natural social order, must strive to regain from the state the right to exclusion inherent in private property. Yet even before they accomplish this, and in order to render such an achievement even possible, libertarians cannot soon enough begin to reassert and exercise, to the extent that the situation still permits them to do so, their right to exclusion in everyday life. Libertarians must distinguish themselves from others by practicing, as well as advocating, the most extreme form of intolerance and discrimination against egalitarians, Democrats, socialists, communists, multiculturalists, environmentalists, ill manners, misconduct, incompetence, rudeness, vulgarity, and obscenity. Like true conservatives, who will have to dissociate themselves from the false socialist conservatism of the Buchananites and the neoconservatives, true libertarians must visibly and ostentatiously dissociate themselves from the false, multi-countercultural and anti-authoritarian, egalitarian, left libertarian imposters.